Assassin's Promise by Thomas Woodward. Chapter 73. Kellen could see the lighted torches that bobbed as they slowly approached the tents he shared with his wife and family. He had just completed another circuit of his patrol, not trusting either Heneb or Dolaran to stay quiet. His gut screamed for him to get the hell out of there. But he would not leave his family behind, nor the woman he had taken under his protection. Perhaps it had been a foolish choice, but he could not stand aside while two women were slaughtered before his eyes. He would never forgive himself for the rest of his days if he let that come to pass. He let the unspoken fear sink into him. Had he doomed the lives of his wife and children by association? None of his goodwill would matter if he were dead. The wind buffeted his face with cold air. It sliced into him through the meager garments he wore. Teeth chattering, he brushed his arms with more fervor, hoping to bring some measure of warmth to them. It wouldn't last, but he didn't care enough to stop. He could hear cries of anger punctuate the stillness of the night. How long would it take to get to him? Would it take to get him and his family out? Too long, he knew. Much too long. If Heneb had managed to turn the entire group against him... They crested the final rise that separated the rest of the camp. Angry Vassin led the group, a red film covering her eyes. She brandished a torch like a club she intended to use. Dark-haired Dolaran edged behind her, his face forming a dark grin. "Bring them out, Kellen! Give us the women you're hiding in your tent!" a man cried, heated anger coloring his voice. Hassim echoed his chant, gesturing crudely. Dolaran waited for Kellen to react, eyes dark as obsidian. "How do we know they killed any of ours?" Kellen knew before he finished speaking it was a vain hope. He himself knew the truth of it. The woman had killed Stringham. As unbelievable as it was a fact. He hoped the others didn't believe it. Maybe he could sway them. Maybe not. "We know they killed a good many of ours, you black-hearted liar," Dolaran's voice boomed above the rest. "Give them to us, Kellen. Go on now, son." Dolaran's voice held a dangerous tone. Vassin struck in with her high, shrill voice. "They killed my husband! They will burn for it!" She spat the words out with raw hate. "If you stay my hand, Kellen, so help me God, I will strike you dead." "He's in league with them," another man howled. "He wants them for his own bed." Kellen could see the ugly emotion covering the shouting man's features. He recognized it easily. Hate mixed with jealousy. Heneb spoke up next. "No need to make this difficult, Kellen. There will be time for that later, if that's your desire. They will last. We will make them last." Kellen felt the bile rise in his gut. Vassin screeched, "I don't care what you do, but by God they will burn!" She waved her burning torch with fury. Kellen spared a moment to look behind him. He met the eyes of his wife, Irna. She held the babes close to her, a determined look in her eye. She knew the danger. Kellen turned back to the throng of people who stood before him. Kellen raised his hands. He would buy them time. "Please, they are hardly more than children, sick with illness. Do not make them pay with their lives, I beg you." Kellen was shoved aside by an angry man. Vassin pushed him to the ground. "Stay there! Do not stop us, Kellen! Do not cast your lot with theirs. There will be nothing I can do for you if you do." Kellen could see the hatred seething through Vassin's features. Heneb pressed down on his shoulder with a boot. "Stay on the ground, Kellen. It suits you fine." With a laugh, Heneb waited for Dolaran and the others to pass him, maintaining the pressure on Kellen's shoulder. Irna stood fast. "You should all be ashamed of yourselves!" Her clear voice rang out over the din. Standing like a cornered dog, she held her babes close in a white-knuckled grip. She placed herself before the tent the two women had collapsed in. "Look at me yet, and you too, Hassim. I know you to be good men. Good men do not kill others in cold blood. Vassin, you disgust me. How dare you even consider taking the life of a young child, one who cannot defend themselves? You knew the bargain when your husband Gennaro took his place as Ranald's right-hand man. You knew one day you would bury him. That was a pact you made. Whether you said it or not, you knew and you agreed. Poor wretch! Spite has overtaken you like a demon. Spite has overtaken you all. Can you not see it? I will not move from this spot. Is Kellen the only good man among you? Do not let yourselves do something that cannot be undone. Irna stood like a thunderhead made flesh. She stood with all the gravity of the camp's doctor, who had administered countless times to many of those who stood before her now. I will not let you do it, Irna repeated with iron-hard finality. You've had your say, Dolaran said, sneering. But it will not be you who decides what will happen tonight. Dolaran turned to the mob of others who still brandished what weapons they had carried forth. Do not forget that they murdered, yes, murdered our own men and women. If we choose to let this go, what will be next? Is there no justice, no honor in exacting punishment upon these killers? Will you stand by while your husbands and wives are murdered and left to rot in a mass grave like carrion? Will you let this woman stand in the way of justice? Dolaran gestured for all to see. Is it really so easy for you to give over? I say we came here for a reason, and we will see that justice done, bloody and terrible though it may be. And no man or woman will stand in our way. Do you not agree? We must take an eye for an eye. They took our young men and women, and so we will take them, burning to their end. Dolaran spoke in a heavy rumble, goading the others on. Are you cowards? No! You are brave men and women. Do not let their lies stymie your hand. Dolaran bellowed in rage, pointing a sharp finger at Irna. Kellen knew this was the deciding moment. Boot pressed into his shoulder. Heneb held him down. Kellen raised his voice. Is this what we have become? Men and women who have hidden from the light so long that we are no better than common footpads? I joined because it was the promise of a better life. It was better than the hell that I left. We had a code. We would give those we robbed a fair chance to walk away unharmed. But they broke that code! They killed us! Another man screamed. Even 2 women? One no older than 12 if she's a day? Do they need to pay with their lives because their guards were too stupid not to throw down their weapons? Is that right? Kellen continued. But they were with them! They should die! They should have known better. Kellen could hear the uncertainty just under the surface of the woman's words. Aye, they were with them, but think for a moment. What if your own daughter, Yev, barely 12 herself, had been among them? Would you still say they must die? My own daughter would never leave our camp without me. The woman's words came out fast and bitter, but some of the heat of the anger had left her voice. I'm sorry, son. It's a terrible shame, but the women must die. There's no changing that now. The old man's voice was reedy and deathly calm. Old Arn was the closest the camp had to a town elder. Many of the others looked up to him in difficult times for guidance. His words had a weight of finality. There's no sense in throwing your lot with them, Kellen. No one will look down on you for making your stand. With that, he cast a searching eye over the rest of the mob of people, looking them in the face in turn. Many of the men and women broke under his gaze and looked away guiltily. See? The others will see sense, but we've come to settle a debt, and nothing on heaven or earth will stay that decision now that it's been made. Fasten stood to the side, nodding grimly in satisfaction. Dolaran held his tongue, but his dark crow's eyes glittered. Kellen knew in his heart this was wrong. He also knew the life of his wife and children may be forfeit if he stood against the rest of the crew. With a resigned disgust plain on his features, he put an arm on Heneb's boot. Move that now, Heneb. I will not stand against Arn's decision. Move, so that I might speak to the poor lasses one last time." Henneb stood above him, grinning. After a moment, he released Kellen and let the man get to his feet, knowing he had won. Watching the man writhe brought him no small measure of pleasure. In a louder voice, Kellen addressed the others. "Will you permit me a few minutes to speak with them before—" Fasten regarded him, the heat of anger still strong on her features. She looked as if she expected trouble out of him, but stood still. "Be quick about it, Kellen. You walk a dangerous line. I would hate to think about casting your family in a poor light in the coming days." The other men and women stood unflinching, torches poised above them. Arn directed a grandfatherly arm towards Kellen. "That's a smart lad. Be fast. What you do is a small kindness, but know that it will not impede what must be repaid in blood. The scales must balance." Irna remained silent, but sweat poured down her brow, and one of the little babes had begun to cry. She bent to cradle the child on her lap, looking away from the crowd, but keeping a stiff back. Kellen felt the stink of what he had agreed to wash over him. He felt cold and dead as he walked towards the tents. Carefully walking into the tent flap, he saw Kayana had come to and been listening in silence. Fear and worry painted her features, and she cast an eye back towards the small form of Millie, who lay in a troubled sleep, sweat covering her brow. She tossed fitfully and hugged the blankets close. Kayana had managed to scrub some of the blood out of her face and hair, but still had a rugged look to her, and Kellen winced when he saw her arm. It looked angry and red where she had been stabbed. It had been wrapped tightly, but some blood had seeped through the top layers of the bandage near the puncture site. Kellen took a breath and attempted to school his features. He found himself unable to, although his words felt lifeless and steeped with despair. "I'm sorry." It hung there, but the blow hit Kellen like a hammer. He felt the shame of his powerlessness. If he stood in the way, they would kill his family and most likely take his own life. He was a coward. He tried to raise his eyes to meet the young woman's, but he could not do it. From the edge of his gaze, he saw Kayana place her hand over his. He could feel the heat of that warmth, of human contact. Still, he could not meet her gaze. The silence that echoed through the tent was more stinging than any words she could have spoken to him. She knew, and she must hate him for his weakness. And yet her hand felt so warm. There was no tension in it, no anger that he could sense. Tears welled into his eyes, and still he could not meet the young woman's gaze. "I do not hate you. You are a good man." Her words were soft and kind. He shook with a racking heave. He hated his weakness. How could he be made to choose between the life of his own family and these young women? He would give his own life. He knew that now. But it would not prevent the murder of his family. That alone stayed his hand, and he hated himself for that weakness. Kayana squeezed Kellen's hand. "Will your people allow me to challenge one of them in single combat? Are they men and women of honor? Otherwise, we will be butchered." Kayana looked down, her face recessed in shadow. Her voice trembled. She must be terrified, Kellen knew. Kellen did not know if other crew members were too far gone to meet this woman's request, but anything was worth trying. Kellen met Kayana's eyes briefly. He heard an anxious grunt from outside the tent. "Hurry up and say your goodbyes, Kellen," a man shouted. He heard someone strike the tent roughly. "Move!" Kayana lay her left hand over Kellen's heavy-bladed sword. Testing the grip, she pulled it out of its sheath, her face not showing any emotion. Kellen backed out of the tent, blocking the entrance. "The woman seeks a chance to fight for her freedom. She wishes to fight one of us in single combat." Kellen looked over the crowd, searching out their reaction. Vassen hissed. Arn stood and said, "Kellen, this is not a demand we will honor. I had hoped it would not go this way, and that they would peaceably lay down their lives. But if we must, we will kill them in their beds." Arn's tone was flat and unwavering, like a slab of cold steel. The decision had been made in his mind. All that was left was carrying it through. Henneb spoke up. "I will gut the woman. Bring her out here, and I will see to it." His speech was slurred with drink as he began to push Kellen aside. "Move, boy!" Dolaron stared daggers at Heneb. "You fool! I say we leave her there and burn the tents down around them." A chorus of agreement echoed through their milling throng of people who stood with weapons in hand. Irna spoke up next. "Are you a coward, then? You, a grown man, afraid of a young woman like her? None of you are half the measure of a man my Kellen is." Irna directed her flinty gaze at Arn, who took an involuntary step back but kept his chin raised. "You are a cur. You, of all of us, should know better than this." Irna's heated gaze forced Arn to look down and away.